second day of the 7-day online faculty development program on sustainable development goals and English literature. I also render a warm welcome to Dr. Anita Rajendran, our guest speaker for today's session. In yesterday's lecture, we learned that literature humanizes us and persuades us to change. In the process of achieving sustainable development goals, literature plays a consequential role. Just like literature, SDGs are also about people. More importantly, they are about the people who are most underprivileged and those who live without dignity. With the determination to leave no one behind being the central driving theme behind them, the SDGs epitomize the spirit of compassion to treasure each life and to be alongside those who are vulnerable and most in need of support. Upkeeping this fervor, diversity and inclusion are pivotal development goals. It aims to promote social, economic, and political inclusion and ensure equal opportunities for all, irrespective of gender, age, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, economic status, or disability. In this purview, gender identity and queer inclusivity are important because they are related to human rights, dignity, and diversity. It promotes self-esteem, well-being among all people, fostering diversity and creativity in different fields and sectors. This further supports social justice goals. The pursuit of diversity and inclusion is indispensable for realizing a fair and sustainable world as envisioned by the SDGs. SDGs can only be achieved by sustainable human behavior. To develop sustainable human behavior means to be the ones who generate and inspire unity, hope, and happiness wherever we are. It is through such effort and behavior that we can effectively realize the SDGs. So queer inclusivity and gender identity are a part of sustainable human behavior that have been explored in literary and cultural texts, as we shall learn in today's lecture titled Queer Stories, Studies in Contemporary Indian Literary and Cultural Texts. I would now request Srishti to introduce our speaker to the participants.
Department of College. University, Sweden, where she spent an academic year 2012 to 13 in residence. She has taught literature over 15 years now, gender and sexuality studies, particularly queer studies, and popular cultural arts, especially the cinemas of South Asia, are her areas of interests. In addition to research articles and conference papers, Dr. Anita is author of Unfamiliar Femininities, Studies in Contemporary Lesbian South Asian Texts, published in 2015 by Oxford University Press, an examination of female non-heteronormativities as expressed in South Asian contexts, including Indian and diasporic Indian cinema.
Thank you so much, Srishti. Now, I would like to request Anita ma'am to please address the participants.
Thank you so much, Dr. Srivastav and the entire organizing team of this FDP. And congratulations on your theme particularly, because as you have rightly noted, the Sustainable Development Goals are about us people the world over trying to actually have better lives and also a more generous and hopeful kind of outlook in existence. So I'm going to actually look at how it is possible to unite a kind of philosophical, spiritual kind of understanding of popular culture with these goals. So if Dr. Sugandha, if you can begin sharing my PPT. I'm pretty sure all of you at this FDP by now fully know and understand the Sustainable Development Goals. But the first 3 slides of this PPT will just lay out a particular goal in front of you, the goal of gender equality, so that we can just start by looking at those specific points before we launch into a discussion. My aim will be to kind of look at how popular texts including some literary texts, which may not be very popular, but also not canonical, may help us or represent these goals in different ways and may help us re-theorize these goals as well. So my paper is provisionally called Queer Stories because to indicate the tentativeness of practically all kinds of identities. So this is goal number 5 from the Sustainable Development Goals, gender equality. And the goals are number 1, to end all forms of discrimination against women and girls everywhere. Second, end forms of violence, specifically sexual and gender-based violence, especially violence like trafficking and other connected kinds of exploitation of women and girls. Then third, harmful practices, especially those derived from gendered and sexual forms of violation like mutilation, etc. Then fourth, to recognize unpaid care and domestic work through the provision of public services, infrastructure. For example, mothers will not be able to work unless there is reliable daycare if mother work is entirely feminized, as we know it is in our South Asian context. Next slide, please. So creation of policy as well as infrastructure, both are in our remit. Could you give us the next slide, please? I think Dr. Sugandha has, I don't think I will be able to move the page, but if Dr. Sugandha is able to, on the next slide, we'll see things like the right to property, the right to representation.
I have changed the slide. I think there is a lag in the connection. That is why it is not.
Okay. That's perfect then. So the idea that women are entitled to equality through a variety of forms of or structures, through structural equality in the form of things like property rights, forms of representation in lawmaking bodies. So things like that are actually specifically important to us in understanding the framework for this paper. So strangely, I'm unable to see anything. But anyway, I will go into the broad content of the paper. So what I'm going to be talking about is, once you've seen all the goals, what I'm going to be talking about is, are queer studies and feminist studies separate things, or can they be similar things, connected things, etc.? And if they can be connected, how does the connection work? So there is a tendency to think of feminist studies, because of its activist beginnings, to think of feminist studies as restricted to just the study of gender, and to think of queer studies as more to do with the study of sexuality itself, as if feminist studies is the more regressive or the more backward thing, and queer studies is dealing with the more progressive or new or exciting things. So gender versus sexuality as a kind of split between these two domains of scholarship is something, I'm not sure if you're seeing the 4th slide, but that's the one that we are on now. So this framework, trying to think of queer studies as having the domain of sexuality and that domain as more advanced, is something that comes from theorists like Eve Sedgwick Kosofsky and Biddy Martin, Gail Rubin, Gail Rubin, as early as 1984 in a famous essay called Thinking Sex, Notes Towards a Radical Political Theory of Gender. She posits the idea that sexuality studies has to be separated from gender studies. So she thinks, she argues that because sexuality isn't just a kind of offshoot of gendered oppression of women within patriarchy, which is a fair point, that point we can take. She says that there should be a separate discipline, and it's one of those originary moments of queer theory, this particular argument. Eve Sedgwick Kosofsky has a similar argument as well in her book Epistemology of the Closet, where she does what she herself calls paranoid reading, looking for silences within texts, looking for the unsaid and the unspoken within texts, etc., and pointing out how sexualities which may not be intelligible within the framework of the heteronormative can be studied and can be, theorized, etc. So the Sedgwick and the Gail Rubin origins kind of create queer theory as you can see the quote there as an anti-identitarian, critical and political commitment, to use Robin Wigman's language. She uses this formulation in her work titled Object Lessons. So splitting sexuality from gender theory like this does have the advantage of showing us that patriarchy is not the only kind of defining architecture, or is not the only kind of thing giving meaning, which as we can all understand, is a very productive and a very hopeful kind of resource for anybody who feels oppressed by patriarchy to just end that point fast. But if we look at other arguments, other formulations of the same idea, Judith Butler, in her book Against Proper Objects, she argues against this position, and she points out, correctly according to me, that the binary genders that we are used to, the idea that, there is one masculine and that there is one feminine, is also a binary created and, supported, maintained through heterosexuality. So, the famous Butler idea that, it's sex/gender rather than sex and gender separately. So all of these things, when we tie them together, we can see that there are two ways of thinking about this whole material. Either you study gender separate from sexuality, or you study sexuality separate from gender. It's like the two can't meet, but we know intuitively that that's not entirely true. So I'm going to look at, what happens when the lesbian subject, sometimes a gay subject, sometimes a trans subject also, but mostly lesbian subjects in this talk. What happens when, lesbian subjects get into narratives? Do we start being able to theorize only sexuality when they arrive, or do we also end up with a theory of gender? Do we end up, doing traditional feminist analysis along the lines of the Sustainable Development Goals that we saw? What happens, say, to reproductive rights when lesbians are in a frame? Or what is a thing called, for example, masculinity on a female body, stuff like that. So these are the things that we're going to look at. And we could do what is called a paranoid reading from time to time, but more or less, we are going to be doing what Sedgwick and Robin Wigman suggest are reparative readings. So instead of looking for only silences and elisions in the text, we're just going to look at many of these texts in a more, in a more direct way. We're just going to allow these texts to, we're going to believe these texts when they say that this is what we are about. So this slide is a kind of sketch of some of the texts that we will refer to. So I don't know if you have seen many of these. I don't know if you have seen any of them or read any of them. So I will offer, as we go along, a few summaries of I'll offer a kind of summary of each of these texts as we move along. So first off, I'm going to start off with the newest text. There's this film called Khofia, which many of you may have seen because it was a recent release. Has anybody seen it? If you have, you could write that in the comments. But if you haven't seen it, it's a spy thriller. And the intriguing thing about this spy thriller is that not only is it relatively realistic for an Indian spy thriller, but it also has a homosexual female protagonist as the central spy. Now, the one of the striking features of her homosexuality is it's completely normalized. Okay, so normally, when you have a queer female subject at the center of a narrative, her queerness will usually be the narrative's focal point. The plot will be driven around her queerness. It'll be about, it'll be like a Bildungsroman or a coming of age narrative of some kind. The big burden will be, shall I come out? When shall I come out? Who shall I come out to? Etc. etc. But here, instead of that typical narrative framed on coming out. Now, coming out narratives have a lot to do with what Eve Sedgwick calls the paranoid narrative, because, in coming out, the basic framework is somebody's identity is hidden. So, of course, when it has to come out, the concept of paranoia, the paranoia as a critical lens is already available to us in this very steady kind of literal way too. But when we think about a protagonist who's already out and a protagonist whose sexuality doesn't seem to bother people around her that much, particularly if that protagonist is, at the center of the national security apparatus, as she is in this narrative, then we're talking something new here for a lot of South Asian narratives. So here, the central character is played by the actress Tabu. So Tabu is, as you know, she's in her early 50s, so she's not a young woman either, which is also a departure from the usual protagonist coming of age or coming to realize what her sexuality is, etc. Now, the coming of age plot has been done a lot, including by the now infamous film Fire. And the Fire is I think probably by now everybody must have watched that film. It's nearly 25 years old, and less well-known films, but still screened from time to time on this or that Indian channels. So not quite so unknown either. Films like the Malayalam film Sancharam. Sancharam literally means journey. So it was made by a diasporic Indian filmmaker, just like Fire was made by another diasporic Indian filmmaker. But both of these have a protagonist. In one case, it's a married protagonist. In another case, it's a single teenage protagonist. But in both of these cases, these individuals kind of go through a journey of knowing their sexuality. So the coming out narrative film is usually a film where the protagonist's sexuality is kind of shown to the viewer, the public, as it were, as a kind of exhibit for us to study or know, or it's almost like a sociological exercise. So in contrast to that is a film like Khufia, where the protagonist is already adult. The protagonist is content with her life. That's a really shocking thing in a lot of gay, lesbian, non-normative narratives, trans narratives also. What will happen is that the protagonist usually needs to disturb their life in order to, just have a dignified existence. But here, the protagonist already has a dignified existence, and her co-workers seem to not at all care about her sexuality. This is really radical. Plus, what is her work? She is a kind of spy master. So she recruits spies. She actively determines, what kind of things to blow up or who to bug. And in fact, the security of the nation is very safe in her hands. So this is a kind of protagonist you would least expect in terms of the usual heterosexual versus the others binary, where heterosexuality is thought of as necessary for the nation or national security, etc. But here, what happens is that we see the queer protagonist, the protagonist who normally would be thought of as not normative, as culturally central also to the project of nation. Now, the plot is moved here by this spy master female character who's lesbian, who happens to be lesbian, meeting another woman in another nation in the course of her professional spy work. And that woman recruits herself to the first protagonist's work, in a sense, because she's also in a kind of specific, relatively mysterious, but a kind of specific journey in which one of the features, at least, is the fight against a certain kind of religious fundamentalism. So again, the interesting thing is, normally it's the queer who's thought of as not normative, therefore not adhering to the rules, and also therefore perhaps as kind of dangerous, or somebody who's going to corrupt society or something like that. But here, what we see is the queer person as just like anybody else, and very much part of the fabric of the nation, the land, the typical operations of the culture, etc. And therefore, already at home in a sense. So this should have been the other, but actually it's not. It's the self. So that's this particular kind of representation, therefore, is able to articulate very, very strongly that queerness need not be decentered, that queerness need not be seen as, unwanted or unwelcome. So I would read Khufia as an instance of the goal of political inclusiveness for queer subjects as met and successfully met. This film also passes what you could call the Bechdel test. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this test, which is in a film, do at least two named female characters talk about something other than one of the male protagonists or other than men. So normally, even sometimes women-oriented films with only women in main parts may fail to meet this criteria because the project of the film may really be to cater to some man's wish or something like that. So the clearing the Bechdel test should be a really low bar, but very often it's not cleared. But here the Bechdel test is also easily cleared. So representing women as autonomous persons, persons with ideas, thoughts, free will, interests of their own, which don't necessarily always go through men, is another goal that is met. And then finally, the one of the most striking things about what is already a relatively striking film is that the queer protagonist has been married to a man, but then they seem to have had an amicable divorce. They have parted successfully, and the man is bringing up again very happily, and it seems by his own will, their child, who has now grown up to be, who is actually a very successful and well-adjusted teenager with good emotional regulation and so on. So what we are seeing here again is the removal of the burden of care labor, mother work, etc., from the feminine. So, and we're seeing this in a very happy and positively productive sense. We're not seeing this as we are not shown this to be the consequences of some kind of tragedy, burden, angst, etc. But we are seeing that it's possible for male persons to successfully take care of children, successfully rear children. As possible for female persons to not be so interested in the domestic and to, instead be interested in saving the nation, like, male protagonists typically do, as we have seen in recent films like, say, Pathan or Jawan or etc., etc. And that it's also possible for female persons to not want a particular kind of heterosexualized nuclear family as their ultimate personal goal in existence. So that way, the idea that human creativity and human structures, such as they are not entirely heterosexual to begin with, is an idea that this film repeatedly underlines. So that is one text that I wanted to talk about. Then next, we are going to talk about, there are some other films on the screen here. So Girlfriend is a relatively mainstream Hindi film release from about 15, maybe 20 years ago. Chutney Popcorn, Bend It Like Beckham, etc. are diasporic films. You might have seen these films, but in both Chutney Popcorn and Bend It Like Beckham, both are quote-unquote films which are, about women. So in Chutney Popcorn, again, we have a lesbian woman who serves as the surrogate mother for a sister of hers who can't conceive, who's unable to carry a child. So there what we see is the lesbian person is seen by her lesbian friends. This film is set in New York, so these contexts are also imaginatively possible there. So her lesbian friends see her as a kind of sellout, They think that how is it possible for a radical lesbian woman to even want or to agree to be a mother in what would conventionally in feminist scholarship be viewed as a relatively exploitative or, a kind of capitulation to patriarchal codes of mothering. So there the film explores this tension. So, if one is queer, can one be a mother out of one's own choice, but then that mother, you're being a surrogate mother. Now, the Chutney Popcorn has a sting in the tail, which is the sister that she's carrying the child for, the protagonist's sister, towards the end of the film, decides she doesn't want the child. So our protagonist is left as a lesbian with a baby, fathered with a person that is her sister's now soon to be ex-husband. But it's clearly it destabilizes so many ideas of not only heteronormative family, but also in terms of the film's plot, ideas of queer family. Because how are we to welcome a white, otherwise heterosexual man into this circle in which this lesbian protagonist is going to mother this child? Is one of the questions. The film. It's a comic film, so the film helps us to consider this in a completely in a completely safe light, so to speak. Nobody's going to die. There's not going to be any very big tragedies. So that helps us to see that films or narratives where, lesbians don't die. Those are usually the minority. So like Khufia here also, the lesbian mother does not die. She doesn't lose her lesbian identity. But clearly, a new kind of world or arena is created in which a certain kind of feminist critique of patriarchy as difficult, demeaning, humiliating, degrading to women who end up being dominated or subordinated by certain kinds of patriarchal figures and ideologies. That critique is also maintained, and at the same time, the idea of queerness as critiquing multiple normativities is also sustained. So that's Chutney Popcorn. Bend It Like Beckham goes in the other direction. There, nobody is lesbian overtly, but a lot of the plot points in the film go in the direction of what we could call the the homoerotic. So it seems like everybody is straight, but some of the things that they do could very well be mistaken for, things that homosexual people do. So what does that mean? Does it mean that straight people are actually also queer? It could mean that, right? So that way, destabilizing the idea of queerness and straightness as two entirely different things, as just being on two sides of the binary, but instead seeing them as on a spectrum is one of those things that Bend It Like Beckham does. And it does this by using, the codes of both the romantic comedy and the sports film. The sports film is usually a male space, and not always, but usually the plot points can typically relate to a male coach, for example, like in Chak De India. Here too, there is a male coach to whom a certain kind of relationality leads to. So one of the female protagonists seems to be interested in the coach, but the coach is also interested back in her. But that's not the central thing in the film. The protagonist's sister is trying to get married, and that causes a lot of tension in the usual sense of marriages being destabilizing. But that tension is also productively resolved through, what we could call traditional kinds of, again, feminist critique. The protagonist's sister wants more space. The protagonist's sister wants a certain kind of acceptance of her own autonomy, and these needs are also met at the same time as the protagonist's right to play football, her right to leave and study abroad, her right to appreciate the footballer Beckham, not for his machismo and conventional male sexuality, but for his skill as a footballer. That's the central joke in the film. So, in between these kinds of comedy plots, what we see is that popular narratives can offer a suitable home where a lot of these desirables are modeled. So you can have families of your own choosing. You need not be killed for expressing your sexuality. You do not have to abandon your home or your culture because of a certain kind of expression of sexuality, which is not heterosexual. The normative family is not the only kind of correct family, or is not the only kind of family that exists even in relatively conservative looking societies or spaces, etc. These points are driven home by these films continually. Now, in contrast to that, if we go on with this reparative reading, if you look at a film like Ek Ladki Ko Dekha To Aisa Laga, there you have it's not a very great film, but it's interesting because there you have the female protagonist is always sad in the film, and in the course of the film, her entire family manages to kind of reassure her that your lesbianism is okay, your lesbianism is fine, we accept your so-called deviance, etc. So if we look at, and it's a conventional kind of mainstream Hindi film in many other ways, songs and a wedding and everything is at the heart of it. So these are, different instances where what seems to be like a fairy tale of acceptance for heterosexuality is other, for homosexuality is visible in popular culture, which leaves us with the question of how real is this, and what is it really a real fairy? Is the fairy tale correct? Are we Are we imagining things when we think that no, real life is not like that, etc.? Which brings us to this final film on that list, which is Gili Pucci. So in Gili Pucci, we can see the complications of the complications and the richness that intersectional reading allows us. There, the protagonist is, unlike in all the other films, she is not a conventionally pretty girl. It's played by the actress Konkona Sen Sharma. So, dark skinned, thin, dressed in a manner that would be deemed masculine for women. So, a figuration of the butch lesbian, the feminine masculine, etc. And also, the protagonist is, as clearly explained to us through different plot points, not a member of one of the upper castes. So she experiences not only discrimination for not being a normative feminine, she also experiences discrimination because she is not a member of the Savarna caste. So in the course of the film, what we see is she has a friend who's a kind of homoerotic, not only fantasy, but also partner to her companion. Though the other woman, who is very conventionally feminine looking, is she's closeted even to herself. So her internalized homophobia will never permit her to understand that the relationship she has with the protagonist is actually, the best descriptor of it would be lesbian or queer. So that protagonist, the other one, is somebody who gets a better job than our first protagonist, who's lower caste, because that other protagonist is upper caste. So the film shows her helping the other one to become a mother, though she desires her, by giving her home to the other girl and her husband, so that they have some space and some privacy. They live in a very crowded, uh, uh, otherwise heterosexual household, which is also it follows a lot of uh, practices which can only be described as completely reprehensible with regards to caste and ideas of pollution, etc. So when the second girl becomes a mother, and she's invited, the first girl is invited to the second protagonist's house to eat, etc., share some snacks and so on. One of the relatives of the second protagonist makes a remark that, isn't this delivering children, for example, your traditional work? And the protagonist also notices that they have served her a separate utensils. So in this film, what happens is that our protagonist, when she goes back to the office, is able to get a promotion because she blocks the woman who has become a mother by disclosing at home, in her home, that it would be better for that person to take a longer extended maternity break, because she realizes that that person hid her caste identity from the rest of her family all this while. In other words, she was pretending that her friend was also upper caste, right? So she did not want to be quote unquote protected in this way. She does not accept this protection as necessary or in any way, a favor or a good thing for her in how she leads her life. Because till now, it has been open and accepting of all her multiple identities, be it, of her gender, because after all, she looks like a masculine man, a thin one, a small one perhaps, but looks like a masculine man rather than a feminine woman at all in the workplace. So, other men treat her as buddies, for example, but she's okay with that identity of herself as butch. Similarly, she's open and accepting of her idea of her essence as a non-heterosexual person. And equally, she's also aware that as a person who is not from a Savarna caste, that caste identity is something that she doesn't want to mask. To mask that identity would in fact be so detrimental to her sense of self and to her sense of integrity, in fact. So when she knows that her lover, her special companion, has in so many ways corroded her identity in how she has represented her to her family in the course of their relationship, this is, a kind of revenge that she gets. Okay, so she gets the better job, which she all these months could not get because she did not think that she needed to. She did not think that she could manage to kind of do this one-upmanship with this girl that she was friends with. So loyalty prevented her. But now that she's understood how disloyal the friend has been, she kind of breaks free and makes the progress that she always wanted to for many years make in her workplace. So the tensions of a gendered progress versus a queered progress are very clear in this narrative too. Now, I don't know how good I am for time. We have at least 15 minutes.
Yes, ma'am, we have plenty of time.
Okay, perfect. So, now I think I will move to maybe these literary narratives which are on the, you can go back to the old slide because the text that I need to speak to. So there's this, you can see the third name there, Kari. Now, if you can go down 2 slides, we'll have an image from Kari. 2, 3 slides, I think. The next one, please. The next one is an image from this is a graphic novel by Amrita Patil. It came out in the year 2008, and what you're seeing on the right, the image on the right is as an image of Bombay. The image is from a French translation of Kari, so please don't worry about the text. But you can see that on a regular map of Bombay, you can see that there are handwritten inscriptions. So this is a woman who, again, like the protagonist in Gili Pucci, she's an instance of the masculine within the feminine, a butch lesbian, somebody who's out as a butch lesbian and very comfortable with that identity, both as of being of a different gender than the normative woman, and at the same time also of a different sexuality than the normative heterosexual. So she has made this map in which you can see the tracings of her journeys through the metropolis of Bombay. So it's a kind of expression of one of the things that text is trying to do is, because she sees herself as free to explore the city due to her androgynous experience, she's able to explore the city in ways in which more conventionally feminine looking women can't explore it. So Kari, takes these very interesting journeys through Bombay at night, or when it's raining and everyone is staring at normative women, because their clothes and popular cultural stereotypes about women wetted by rain as sexualized objects, etc., don't apply to her particular kind of body. She sees herself as free, despite whatever time it is, or doesn't matter the action of the elements, etc., to see this world. So she's a kind of classic flaneur. She can go anywhere she wants. She can go anytime she wants. So what is it that she does? So she's a young woman, and the narrative is set in the early part of India's liberalization, so early 90s. And it's a narrative where it's clear to us that Kari has just broken up with her lover. That's on the next screen. Could we see that, please? She's broken up with a woman who others in the narrative suspect is not real. Okay, so they think that this. Could we move on? Have you already moved on? Okay, yeah, now I can see it too. So you can see from the woman on the left that that's the conventional female normative, whatever, maybe an idealized type, but more easily identified as conventionally normative feminine. And on the right is Kari. So Kari has just broken up with the girl on the left. Her name is Ruth. But others in the narrative suspect that Ruth is this fictional person. So this is actually a classic heterosexual instance of ghosting or being unable to see the female homosexual as having a life at all. Okay, so in a sense, that is all of us who identify as heterosexual being paranoid. Okay, we don't see we don't see homosexuals as having lives. So whenever any homosexual person if ever any homosexual person were to say, look, I have X relationship and it's thriving, or etc., we kind of become unable to accept that reality. So what we have over here is this is the first frame in the graphic novel. So what we have here is Kari and Ruth linked. You can see their veins connecting their hearts, etc. And what the text tells us is Ruth has managed to cut the vein. So the next frame shows blood and so on, and Ruth has managed to cut her. This is not an umbilical relationship, so it's not the maternal framework is not there. clearly it's romantic, and it's both a conventional cliche that you will see in a lot of mainstream films, but this frame is also clearly a kind of remodeling of Frida Kahlo's famous picture. So, referencing both high and low arts in different ways is to signify that human relationships are the same. Doesn't matter what kind of sexuality or what kind of caste or what other kind of identity you want to use. Everybody has human relationships. Everybody desires them. So the even though this vein is cut by Ruth, who heterosexuals the book over, whether they are female or male, constantly keep doubting. Okay, so this idea of Ruth's existence as a source of dubiety for other narrative, other protagonists and the other characters in the narrative leads to the protagonist telling us, the reader, we are her constant friend and kind of the person who's addressed. So her persona tells us constantly that this is the world I live in. Nobody believes that I can have a reality as a queer female person, but what to do? I'm real. There's a whole book here where I'm the protagonist. So she goes through she goes through Bombay's sewers, for example, after after the waterways of Bombay are kind of polluted and crowded over by different kinds of human debris every day. So that can be plastics on the average day, or it can be, the remains of the statues of Ganesh immersed after festivities, or it can be other kinds of debris, whatever it is. Because Kari has insomnia, Kari's nights are spent now that Ruth has left her. Ruth has gone to another country. Kari's nights are spent cleaning up the rivers. Okay, so here again is the queer person as doing the job, doing the immense labor of sustaining this world. So we may think that this world is completely heterosexual, but here is our superhero, cleaning up all of this debris so that the water can flow and so that circulation is not destroyed, and without good water bodies, well, what would human beings do? Human civilization would also come to an end. So the civilizational work done by queer people is, in different ways acknowledged by these different texts. And now if we can go back to the previous slide. So when we see this space of Bombay as a space where the queer protagonist can freely walk, right? Go anywhere. You can see how big Bombay is, but you can also see how big Kari's black lines are. One of those lines is the line that she takes on the train every day. And those other more calligraphed lines are the lines where she walks. And, she through walking, she finds a variety of relationships. So, she finds a woman who takes care of stray animals somewhere. Then to that woman, she gives a house cat that was the house cat of a friend of hers who dies suddenly of cancer. She meets that friend through her advertising work, for which, she goes from one end of the city to the other on the train, etc. So, the queer protagonist as dynamic, as having access to things like economic mobility, things like creativity, reproductive rights, but still, she can't have a child because if at all she wanted to have a child, she wanted to have it with Ruth, but Ruth is not there. And besides, how do two lesbians anyway have a child? So another kind of rethinking of family needs to happen. Meanwhile, there are others in the narrative who don't want to have children. Okay, so there are there's a woman who has an abortion because she doesn't want to have a child with that particular person, and she has been that's not her primary relationship, so she can't really have a child if she doesn't want her partner to find out that she has been quote unquote dishonest. Then there's a man, one of Kari's best friends. His name is Lazarus, who kind of is reborn, suddenly because he undergoes an HIV scare. So there are all these instances of quote unquote normal people, okay, the heterosexuals of this world not being able to understand or value their reproductive power, as it were, and the difficulty that queer people have because they don't have full control over or full a full range, a free range of similar or reproductive access or protections because of different kinds of heterosexualized controls, especially legal controls, is suggested variously through the text. Now, could we go back a slide, please? So this is, one kind of protagonist where the protagonist is young, but the focus of the narrative is not coming out because due to her gender, this protagonist is already out. She does not look like the conventional normative woman of whom everybody expects, because of her hyperbolic femininity, everybody expects heterosexuality. So this is not a woman who's passing in any way. So these narratives all help us to consider the normative feminine, in fact, as a kind of, almost like a kind of burden for protagonists who are far more at ease with their intersectional, gendered, sexual identities, and sometimes also caste identities, as in the case of Gili Pucci. Now I'm going to come to maybe my final text here. If we have more time, then I might talk about one more, but I'll talk about this text, Mahadevi Varma's. Mahadevi Varma is the great Hindi poet. So her autobiography is called My Family, and it was released in Ruth Vanita's translation. That's the cover 2 years ago. So, with a text like this, what we have is, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Mahadevi Varma's poetry. So her particular style of poetry, innovations in language, etc. And the kind of mark she has left as an author in the cultural framework of our country's literature is not a small one. Now, the interesting thing here is that she traces that linguistic fluidity and energy and richness and creativity to her best friends. Who are her best friends? Her family. Who is that family? These animal protagonists that you see on the cover here. So you can see in the front, there's this creature that looks like a little deer. Then it's a tiny fawn actually who grows up. And then there's this squirrel in the background. You can see a cow, and there are other creatures. There's a peacock. There are some chicks, etc. So the idea that again, this brings us back into the gendered feminist part of the narrative. The idea that women deserve autonomy, women can claim autonomy, and that autonomy can be claimed or a rich creativity accessed through being able to autonomously form relationships with other creatures is one of the things that helps us to put queer and feminist studies together to think of, queer feminist positions. So here, how Mahadevi Varma's My Family helps us to do that is, for Mahadevi Varma, from the time that she's a child, she registers how, as a child, she first started noticing animals somehow because it was her temperament, etc. And one of the earliest stories in this autobiography, that it's like the beginning of this sequence of pen pictures. It's the beginning of this, in the beginning of the series of pen pictures, she has this chapter called Atmika. So it's like, of my soul, right? She says, some of these animals that I met as a young person were of my soul. And which are these young animals? Some chicks. So in her boarding school, there were some animals in general, but also the woman who did the gardening had some chicks. And there were 5 chicks, hens, offspring chicks. And one day, one of those chicks goes missing because a new teacher who had come wanted one of those chicks to serve as, as food, as meat. So, if you think of an animal as just poultry, then obviously that in that logic, the animal does not have relevance as a family member, etc. But for Mahadevi Varma, and the child is very young at that time, she must be 7 perhaps. So for Mahadevi Varma's persona, the chick is clearly family. It's not poultry or a thing, etc. So she fights with and she manages to successfully save this chick from being eaten, and she connects the act of saving that chick to her ability to voice herself. Okay, so she credits her amazing literary journey to this beginning. She says, I learned to write, to enumerate. I gained a voice by learning how to enumerate all of my animal friends, my family, because there was no other mark connecting us. Our appearances are so different. How does a chick connect to a human girl? It doesn't except through words. So she sees the journey of language, as enabled. Now we would say this is ironic, but because we have a tendency to think that animals don't have a language, but or don't have languages. So she sees her own journey to language as enabled by these other creatures. So through that journey comes a certain kind of very feminist sensibility, and also in her history and the kind of things that she has done, we can see that the contributions that she has made to political and feminist solidarities are immense. So they all come from being able to see the animal as part of the same world, and not only of the same world, but as kin to us, as a family member to us, as individuals, as as individuated, etc. So I think I can try to kind of conclude now a little bit. So in the course of thinking about these different kinds of texts, in the course of understanding how queerness works and how queerness can connect with gendered subjectivities, I think we see that a lot of narratives are able to, or a lot of narratives already do represent values that today would fit into what we think of as sustainable goals. And it is important to access a variety of traditions to understand that the dream of sustainability, the dream of equality are not just utopic fictions, and they're not inaccessible, but they're very much present and around us, especially in mainstream texts, but certainly also in important canonical figures like Mahadevi Varma, or in important breakthrough artists like Amrita Patil. So, if we have time in the discussion, I might talk about one more text, The Mothers of Mayadi, which is actually about how utopia is not so unreal, is not a fantasy, is not so, fantastic or dreamy as much as it is realist. But I think for now, since I seem to have spoken for at least an hour, I think I will rest myself for a bit, and I hope to have a very fruitful discussion with everybody who has heard this. And thank you for listening.
All right. Thank you so much, ma'am. Can I stop the screen sharing now?
Yes, you can.
Okay. So, shall we ask the one or two questions that our participants have asked?
Yes, certainly.
Okay, ma'am.
Good evening, ma'am. Please try this side. There is a question which has been asked. Okay, ma'am. Would you please throw some light on the difference between liberal feminism, radical feminism, and queer feminism?
So, if we think of the goals of each of these types, I think we would get closest to articulating what each group or each category wants. So, a liberal feminism, I think, can be best thought of in terms of best defined in terms of incremental goals, which don't really destroy the status quo. So, it is within we conserve the framework that we are in, and we incrementally add goals where things improve dramatically, but dramatically in terms of, say, the last 50 years or last 200 years or something, but not dramatically in terms of, say, ideation or structure, as it were. So, the sustainable development goals, in a way, are actually liberal feminist goals, because we are talking about increasing the percentages of, say, in the sustainable development goals, it has been found that countries with protections for the female gender, in the sense that if there is a reservation, for example, for female lawmakers, countries with protections like that will have a higher percentage, like the percentage will be, say, 30%. Countries without protections will have at the most 20% female lawmakers. India has much less, it's closer to 10%. So going up like that incrementally from one number to another. These goals can also be measured in terms of time, So one measurement on the UN website says that it'll be 140 more years at the current rate of speed for child marriage to be eradicated in this world, for example. So thinking incrementally for any kinds of goals would broadly be liberal feminist. Thinking in terms of dramatically overhauling the structure would be radical feminist. So what would be radical feminist? If we look at, say, a short story like Sultana's Dream, I don't know if any of you have read it. It's Ruqayya Sakhawat Hussein's short story from 1905. It's this dramatic utopic fantasy. Which woman has time in the evening to lie down and dream, right? But that clearly shows you it's fantastic stuff. So when you're busy making dinner, if you're female in the evening, because most housework, at least at the level of responsibility, might fall to a lot of women, this woman dreams. And what does she dream? The men are no longer in the public sphere in the dominant way in which they are in our conventional world. So where are they? They are in a kind of remodeled Zenana type space called what else? The Mardana. So the value system has been reversed. And in that reversal of value system, women or, female protagonists have really blossomed because they've taken over the world and the public sphere, and they're doing all of those things that men would have otherwise done, but they're doing them differently and better because the men are not there in that sphere. What has happened is that the kind of possibilities available to these women has been tremendously, radically huge, and therefore they're able to rethink a lot of systems ground up. So utopic narratives give us a kind of idea of radical change, wherein undoing a system rather than simply adding to it, whether, in 100 years or 150 years is the priority. Now, with queer feminism, like I said at the beginning, queer feminism can be, it can be, queer studies as a kind of critical tool is a tool that helps us to think about different kinds of sexual normativities and how they connect to different kinds of identities. So can queer feminism be liberal? Yes, it can be. Because if you think of, for example, there is no marriage for queer people like there is for quote unquote straight people, right? So adding that particular form of legal union and the rights that follow from it can be thought of as a liberal kind of instance of queer politics. But at the same time, if you think, why does marriage even need to exist? Why should only, married partners or those are considered in the stead of married partners be given rights over other beings? Can we radically rethink, who is allowed to sign consent on your form when you go to a hospital to get admitted, to extend the breadth beyond biological family or married partners, etc. When we rethink family itself altogether like that, as for example, Mahadevi Verma does in her book, then that would be an instance of queering in a very radical kind of framework. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, ma'am. Now we have another question by a scholar from University of Lucknow. Educational and reflective literature in today's world is actually not gaining the credit that it should have. How are we as students of literature supposed to represent the theories of queer and other topics of gender and narratives of sexuality to make it more acceptable?
I truly hope that is what I have done with my paper, because I have tried to go in the direction of looking at the text and then putting theoretical, vocabulary or theoretical understandings into how we talk about the text. So I would suggest that that is one way of trying to get to grips with the richness of a lot of theoretical writing. We have to go out of our way to make it accessible not only to students but also to ourselves, because many times we are reluctant to read theory. Why is that? It's more boring than watching a film or reading a novel, right? I mean, I know that if any of you here is a teacher, you have experienced this great distressing burden of what to do when you have to, really like break a theoretical text down to a level of discourse or a level of pleasing enough interaction, right? So we don't really have to, put theory first is my second suggestion. I think that, in some ways, we can afford to look for interesting books which are not really of the hard, academic, difficult kind of theory that we expect a theoretical framing to be. So if we look at, for example, Monique Wittig tells us so much about a certain kind of radical feminist understanding. So does Suniti Namjoshi, Mothers of Mayadeep, which was on one of my slides, but which I think will be a little bit overwhelming to start talking about right now. But in that text, there's this utopia. It's called Mayadeep. Okay, so it's an island like Lakshadweep. God knows where it is. It's somewhere. Okay, so that's the funny part of the. It must be hoga. I mean, patriarchy agar hai to uska alternative bhi hoga na. I mean, what is so unnatural about it is Namjoshi's very wry way of thinking about utopia. If we have, a boring and difficult world, surely there should be an alternative to it is normalized. So in that world, we have in Mayadeep, every woman is a mother. But some mothers are grade A, some mothers are grade B, and some mothers are grade C. Grade B are biological mothers. Grade C are caregiving mothers. Okay, but they don't have high social status. The sound familiar, no? Sounds like nannies, teachers who are female in primary schools are not given any credit, or the nurses who look after our children when they're tiny, stuff like that, right? But in Mayadeep, all the women are mothers, and grade A mothers are like those power couple people. And Mayadeep has no men, so it's like this step further from Sultana's dream. It's also 800, 700 years in the future. It's not like in 1905 as Sultana's dream was. So, when we consider the plot of the Mothers of Mayadeep, you realize that it's actually an analysis of different kinds of queer studies theory. So things like lesbian separatism, plural feminisms, does the liberal feminist narrative work? These things are all cogently considered through the plot. So sometimes we might be lucky enough to find texts like that. And I think that's really where, as literature scholars, our work should be. In the different languages that we read, in the different things that we enjoy, there are immense numbers of texts that will give us very fruitful, really enjoyable, what shall we say, like food for thought, food for biting into, nourishment. I think, theory might sometimes be difficult in classrooms where students especially are reluctant to read. But student after student enjoys being able to learn how to see or read a text and understand, oh, that is what you meant by liberal feminist. That was what you meant by decolonization. Oh, this is appropriation, right? So like that, I think if we go ground up, perhaps, there is hope for us as teachers.
Thank you for answering that question, ma'am. Now we have a question from a master's student, Shiva Dikshit. He wants to ask, do you think concept of new pronouns and genders creates more indecisiveness in upcoming generations or in current times?
So you mean pronouns like he, she, they? They is a very old pronoun in English, for example, right? So, the idea that gender fluidity or sexual fluidity is new is perhaps the problem idea here. If you look at a lot of our mythical traditions or a lot of our ways of speaking, especially in Hindi, if you use the aap formulation, aap kya kar rahe hain, as opposed to aap kya kar rahi hain. So, the idea that it has to be binary in a certain way is already questioned by your connection with class, if some kinds of female power are constantly referred to with the so-called universal masculine, etc. So the idea that binary gender is the only operating thing in language is very often not true. And I don't know if it creates confusion. I think it certainly creates a certain kind of critical receptivity, which many of us might be uncomfortable with. But so what, I mean, there are so many uncomfortable things in this world that otherwise we endure. Here, there is something very productive to think about, which is that the pronoun typically is a giver of identity for the user. So this is a point at which we do need to think about what do we gain by refusing somebody else their identity. that might be discomforting if we come from a position of uncritical power. But otherwise, I think, if we are in a meaningful relationship with ourselves and we are healthy enough to be able to be analytical, I don't think it needs to be confusing. I think it can be, just rewarding and fun also in many ways, right?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for answering that question. Now, Dr. Shubhra Joshi wants you to suggest some texts based on queer literature other than the ones that you've spoken about in your lecture.
Oh, yes. So, since it's an FDP and perhaps many of you have the luxury of reading, I would suggest my top favorite amongst Indian writers, which is Ismat Chughai's Tedi Lakir. It has a translation in English. It's called The Crooked Line. And I really think that it is an amazing book, which is rewarding on so many levels. It doesn't matter which language you try to read it in, because it's a classic queer book. It's not really a coming out narrative. It's not really a narrative where anybody dies. It's not really a narrative where, there's so much happiness that you feel like this is fake. It's a complex book where the female subjectivity and its inability to be fixed to what is called a straight line, a straight pattern, the normative, the struggles with the normative that actually that we think of as that critical identity called queer, they are so interestingly outlined in this book and so richly, because Ismat Chughai has a distinctive voice unlike any other perhaps in subcontinental writing. So this is, I would say this is like my number one suggestion. Then now I have to think a little bit more, because most of the other books are relatively more conventional in the sense of, being more easily fixed to a gay or a lesbian identity. And sometimes these kinds of narratives are very good, but they may, they may not survive 10 or 12 readings as great works of literature sometimes can. So films like, say, Badhai Do, that kind of film is a more identitarian type of film. Then I think, let me think about this in the back of my head. From the top of my head, I'm not able to figure out which book I would rate amongst my top 3, but soon I'll tell you 2 more names.
Okay, no problem, ma'am. I can always share it later with the participants.
Yeah.
And ma'am, another question. This is from another master student, Mantasha Azim. She wants to know what challenges still persist for filmmakers striving to achieve authentic and respectful representation of LGBTQ plus characters. How, in your opinion, can these challenges be effectively addressed within the realm of cinema and media studies?
So very good question. And, the conservatism of filmmaking is typically a product of the amount of money involved in both film production and publicity. So film is actually typically a far more conservative medium than literature is. Despite anything else that we might think about for censorship or circulation, etc., film remains more vulnerable. So the big problem would be, first of all, if you are casting actors. So in a film like Chandigarh Kare Aashiki, the pressure to use a heterosexual, otherwise straight-seeming actor as opposed to a bona fide, trans actor calls immediately to question the idea of what's the connection between authenticity and, activism, between authenticity and political correctness also. So should straight people play queer people? Of course, sometimes they can. But if it's a should, and if it's about, increasing opportunities for all kinds of representation, then it would be better if we could have trans persons play roles like that. But if you look at the broad mainstream of actors, especially actors who have not broken through, it would be very difficult in many public contexts in our contemporary world in South Asia to be out as not heterosexual and still make it in a business like that, where, the binary romantic hero-heroine plot is the staple of a lot of mainstream filmmaking. So, given that kind of market, given that kind of taste, getting actors who might have that authentic breadth of experience can be very difficult. But as we know, artists are excellent at subversion, thank goodness, and therefore, we do find a lot of material which codes as queer, in which the homoerotic is very clear, like in big successes like Bend It Like Beckham, or not so well-known films like Chutney Popcorn also. So the big challenge there is then, if you don't have a political context in which authentic personal identities can be revealed, then you will have films where this kind of coding and masking, hiding in plain sight are the norm. And there we'll have to do what Eve Sedgwick calls the paranoid reading, There might be two straight people, but their behavior is definitely queer. Like if you take films like Cocktail, say, in Cocktail, the two girls in the narrative have a great friendship. And the film ends with the two girls reuniting with the male character standing right there. So that's actually, is not a regular heteronormative two-person pair. It's something else, but it's a mainstream film. So they are just friends in that film. There's this intensity though to their relationship, which we can certainly call queer. So learning to identify those things is something that readers can do. And presenting these things openly and fairly, perhaps filmmakers will find very difficult to do unless circuits of production and distribution are, given the possibility of free speech. So yeah, political freedoms, it comes down to that.
Right. So I think that's it for the questions. However, there are many compliments for Dr. Rajendran's lecture, which ma'am is not able to see, but I'd like to share a few of them. People are saying it has been a very enlightening lecture, really impressive session, very informative, insightful. So these are the adjectives that are being used. And I just wanted to let ma'am know that people are really appreciating what they've heard. And some of the teachers are really interested in finding out more about the field. So it has piqued their curiosity and they'd like to find out more about gender identity and queer representation. So if ma'am would like to speak more, then ma'am, you're free to do so. Otherwise, we can ask Dr. Tulika to conclude.
I think, all I would like to say is it was a delightful session, and I'm so glad to know that it is appreciated, because when one is speaking online, one has no clue what one is doing. And, this is my first time using Microsoft Teams. So I saw some bubbles going up. But it's only now that I have the time to consider that some of them were, hands clapping and so on. So I'm very grateful to an audience at this hour of the day for having paid attention, let alone showing appreciation. So thank you so much for that. Then as far as reading about queer stuff goes, my book is a good entry point. But you don't have to read my book just because it's my book. But at the same time, it's one of those kinds of books that is relatively easily readable. And therefore, I can safely recommend it. It's called Unfamiliar Femininities, and it's from OUP. You'll find a lot of book recommendations in that book because I've analyzed female non-heteronormativity as the core thing. And if you want to read more about South Asian especially, queer, non-normative kinds of writings, one author I would particularly strongly recommend, going back to the earlier question, is Hoshang Merchant. He is an innovative poet and really quite something else from a lot of other voices. So after Ismat Chughtai, I would recommend Hoshang Merchant. And maybe, the third person, though I've dealt with her book Kari, would be the graphic novelist Amruta Patil. Any of her works, and all of them are not about queer subjects, but any of her works is actually, is able to explode the normative in very, very interesting ways. So in her redrawing of the Mahabharata, for example, how she presents normative male masculinity, that is quite something to see. So, she shows how the different kinds of masculine can exist. And within her framework, these masculines can all be, differently desirable, autonomous, given a kind of an ocular identity, which artists, both male and female in the past, have not been able to do. Then her book Aranyak shows the natural world. Again, all her books do that with the natural world. So, they are tremendous in showing the sphere, the the mobility, the richness of the biotic world around us. So maybe she would be my third. Then I don't know, what can I say? I think the important thing for anybody who wants to enjoy any kind of literature and art would be to constantly just keep our eyes open and appreciate great artists. So I'm very glad that I had this opportunity to share my take on these artists with all of you. And I think that's about it from me. I would just like to thank the organizers for giving this opportunity. So thank you, Dr. Sugandha, for getting in touch with me and making this session happen.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you. And I'd like to ask Dr. Tulika to kindly conclude.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rajendran, for such a stimulating and stirring session. And we all extend our heartfelt gratitude for taking time from your busy schedule to shower us with your gems of wisdom and knowledge. And your words have definitely magnified our cause in the best possible way, I must say. I also thank all the participants for joining and engaging in a healthy and informative discussion. Your spirit is highly appreciated. Also, I would like to request all the participants to fill the feedback form, which will be posted in the WhatsApp group. You have to fill the form to mark your attendance for the session. Have a good day, all of you. And you all can leave the meeting now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.